Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and I just watched the new episode of Star Trek Discovery, and I think it's the first episode of the show which actually feels like a Star Trek episode. So it feels like the writing became suddenly much better, maybe because they fired the previous writers, and from this episode onwards, it's all written by new ones, so maybe the show will get better, maybe it will become a Star Trek show finally. As for the technobabble dialogue, some of it is actually interesting. Everything that has to do with that asteroid that Tilly wanted a sample of, all of that sounds very interesting, and visually they did it really well, so I do give them points for the visual effects, and even the technobabble is not that bad. Other pieces of technobabble were pretty terrible, like they mentioned sonar in space, but it's a kind of gravitational sonar, so maybe they're doubling down on that stupidity from the previous season, because they mentioned something about sound being transmitted into space and being used as space sonar. And I didn't make a huge deal out of that because I kind of presumed they don't mean sound in space, they actually mean that it's being changed into some kind of subspace radiation or something like that, and maybe subspace is kind of like sound waves, kind of like the ether, waves in the ether in the faster than light dimension. So I didn't make a huge deal out of the sonar in space comment in the previous season because they said it's like sonar, not really a sonar. So here we have a scene of Tilly saying something about gravimetric distortions can be used as sonar. Then they try to find where the new red signal is coming from, and then Michael suggests going into warp and then stopping so that they can measure the changes in the red shift to determine where it is. Now my problem with that is that if this signal just appeared on the other side of the galaxy, then that means they cannot possibly see the light from it. They have to detect it using some kind of subspace scanner, I guess, which is faster than light. And so it doesn't really make sense to measure the spectrum of the light, the red shift or a blue shift to determine where it is. Doesn't really make sense because they're not supposed to be seeing that with normal light. But I guess with subspace anything is possible, so we can make up excuses. So we can say that they somehow can scan it through subspace, and maybe that's why they had to go to warp to be able to scan it while at warp. So it's a bit jumbled mess, this technobabble. But all the old Star Trek shows, they always had some pretty bad technobabble, especially in Voyager. That's one of the reasons I hated Voyager. They were just throwing out particle names at random without any kind of scientific facts at all. And so I actually think the technobabble in this show is not that bad in comparison to Voyager. So as I said, everything that has to do with the asteroid and Tilly, that was actually pretty good. Tilly is suddenly an ensign, and I must have missed when exactly did they promote her. So they decide to use the spore drive to get to that new signal, which is on the other side of the galaxy, in the beta quadrant. It's nice they always use the beta quadrant in the show because, it's the only one that wasn't really explored in all the other shows, because we know all about the delta and the gamma. And so in this show they always go to the beta quadrant, so that's fine, I guess. But what annoys me is that only now they suddenly remember they have a spore drive, so shouldn't this have been the reason that Pike wanted the Discovery in the first place? Because he says that all these signals are all over the galaxy, tens of thousands of light years away, so normal ships would not be able to reach them. So shouldn't this have been the reason that he wanted the Discovery to use the spore drive to get it, and yet it seems to be like an afterthought. Oh, we have the spore drive, so that's how we'll get there. This should have been in the previous episode. This should have been the reason from the get-go. So that makes it kind of stupid, because in the previous episode they said that they're dismantling the spore drive, they're putting it all in storage, while in the middle of a mission to investigate signals which are 30,000 light years away. So shouldn't they have been planning to use the spore drive from the get-go? Also, they kind of throw a comment about Starfleet not approving its use because it depends on Stamets, who has been genetically augmented to be able to pilot this system. And so it's not allowed under Starfleet law, which is a very cheap excuse to explain why this hasn't been used later, for centuries later. So I don't really buy it. They better provide a much better excuse for why they won't use it again later. And it's also funny how Pike suddenly gave them permission. He kind of says, oh, so Starfleet did allow you to use it because of the war, and so if they allowed you to do it then they will allow us to do it now, to investigate these signals. So shouldn't he be able to do that forever, like finding excuses every time he needs to use it? Whenever there's any kind of emergency, just say, oh, the Starfleet will give us permission this time, but I won't bother to actually ask them. So it made it all very laughable as well, I think. And also, what's the big deal about these signals anyway? Like, they detected signals appearing in the galaxy, so what? What's the big emergency here? Especially if it's also far away, so what's that big of a deal that you have to investigate it right away? So much so that you presume that Starfleet will give you permission to use this illegal technology suddenly. I guess if they already knew what we heard in the trailers, Spock saying that this is a danger to the whole galaxy, but they don't know this yet, so we didn't yet hear Spock say this on the show. And so this shouldn't really be an emergency, and so why are you doing something illegal and you just presume that Starfleet will allow it without actually asking them? So this is really funny, I think. And as I said, they could have simply said in the previous episode, right from the start of the season, Pike should have immediately said, Starfleet gave me this ship for this specific mission and gave me permission to use the spore drive, and that's why I want the ship. Then it would make sense that he got all the permission he needs in advance, and that's why he wanted the ship. And yet the way it's been done is if it's all by accident. Oh, so Discovery just happened to be near the Enterprise. That's why he took the Discovery, and they were dismantling the spore drive because it's illegal, but suddenly they do need it, and so suddenly they do use it, and he just presumes that Starfleet will give a permission without actually checking. I mean, it's still all near the Federation, right? So what's the problem to contact one of the admirals to ask for permission? So they teleport to the Beta Quadrant, and then they found a village of humans who appear to have been taken during the Third World War, and they were saved from the nuclear war because they went into a church, and then the Red Angel teleported them to this planet, I presume together with the church itself. So it's all kind of silly, but it does feel very similar to a whole bunch of old plots in Star Trek about humans who were taken from Earth and planted on other planets by some guardian aliens or whatever, and so this does seem very Star Trek-ish, and so I can't really complain about it. Now, what kind of bugged me is that Pike immediately says that because they were taken from a pre-warp Earth, that means the Prime Directive applies to them, and so they cannot reveal themselves to these humans and can't intervene in their affairs because it's like violating the Prime Directive. And I'm immediately thinking it doesn't really make sense. Also, there was a line in TNG in the episode The Masterpiece Society in which the Enterprise saved some human colony, but as a result they affected the change in their society, and then Picard wonders at the end of the episode that maybe they shouldn't have intervened, but then Riker tells him that because they're human, that means the Prime Directive doesn't apply. And then Picard says, well, maybe it should, but all throughout the episode he never said that the Prime Directive actually does apply. He kind of ponders that idea in the very end after the events, and the fact that Riker says that it only applies to aliens. And it also fits with what we've seen in all of Star Trek. Whenever there's any kind of human colony, they are able to intervene in those colonies because it's kind of their own species. The only exception was if time travel was involved, so if someone was going back in time to the more primitive Earth, then obviously he was not allowed to intervene in the past, but that has to do with the temporal Prime Directive, so it's not exactly the same thing. It was designed to protect history, not really protect the society. So here Pike suddenly says that the Prime Directive does apply to these humans because they were taken from a pre-warp society. And they are still pre-warp, and so they cannot intervene. So it doesn't really make sense, it doesn't fit with Riker's dialogue. Previously on this show there were other contradictions with the Prime Directive, but I always kind of made up excuses for that, saying that because this is taking place before the other shows, maybe the Prime Directive is not exactly the same, and so I was willing to give it a break. I was saying that maybe the Prime Directive became much harsher later because they seem to be taking a lot of liberties with it in this show. Like in the very first episode they intervened on some planet and some of the locals saw them, and so I was kind of making excuses for that and saying maybe the Prime Directive is not as harsh yet, and yet here suddenly it seems more harsh in the past. So they are not allowed to reveal themselves to a human colony, even though in the future they can. I guess I can explain it by saying that in the TNG episode, that colony they met was not pre-warp, it was post-warp humans who arrived there with a ship, and so that's why the Prime Directive doesn't apply, because they are humans and post-warp. But theoretically, if you met a colony of humans who are still pre-warp, who were taken to another planet by someone else, not using their own technology, and they came from primitive Earth, then maybe the Prime Directive should apply. But shouldn't this be kind of a very rare event? I mean, how many of such cases there are? Well, I guess to think about all the examples from Star Trek, it's pretty common, I guess. But still, it's kind of fishy that this would even be included in the normal Prime Directive, because it's such a bizarre scenario that I don't think anyone would have predicted it. So I don't think such circumstances would even be mentioned in the Prime Directive. So I guess Pike just decided by himself that's the way things should be. So anyway, they go down to that village and they go into the church and they see that it's kind of a religion which is combining all the Earth religions into one religion. But what I found strange in it is that they say all these people were sitting in a church when they were teleported to this other planet. So shouldn't they all have been Christians there? I mean, they were rescued from a church. So I assume they all lived next to the church, and so wouldn't they all be Christians anyway from the get-go? And also, since they were rescued in a church, that should make them all Christians. They should all believe in Christianity if that's the place that saved them. And so it doesn't really make sense why would they all be a mixed religion. I guess all those people who happened to be in that church were all from different backgrounds, and so some of them didn't want to give up their original religions, and so as a compromise they kind of united all the religions into one when they arrived on the other planet. Another thing that kind of bugged me, when they showed the recording from a soldier's camera from when they were taken from Earth, we see the soldiers looking exactly like the soldiers of today. Shouldn't they look like futuristic soldiers? Actually, they should look like that soldier that Q impersonated in the first episode of TNG. He appeared on the bridge as a soldier, which I always presumed to be from the nuclear war. And that outfit did look kind of silly, but with a little modifications it can actually look cool and still be similar to that. So I think these soldiers they showed should have looked something like that. Because I presume it was from the same time period, because Q always showed them like the post-atomic horror, and he showed up as this soldier, and he showed how soldiers are using drugs and so on. So this should have been the design of the soldiers we see from this time period. So that was a bit disappointing. They kind of just showed a normal looking soldier from today. Maybe what Q showed was the outfit of the enemies of the United States, and what we saw in this flashback is American soldiers who still look like today. So I guess we can explain this away, but still it would have been much cooler and much better continuity wise to actually show us the kind of outfits that we saw in TNG from this era of humanity. I would have appreciated that a lot more, because I just love attention to detail, and it would have been more interesting also to see something different than just today's stuff. So anyway, we see them meeting these religious people on the planet, and they pretend they're from another territory on the planet. And I kind of assumed all the religious people would be evil, because that's the kind of stuff that was always being done on Star Trek, showing religion in a bad light. And so I immediately thought they're going to put them to the stake, that they're going to try to burn them all alive because they're not like them. Something like that. I immediately thought of that, also because when they read from their religious books, they kind of quoted the evil passages, and so I immediately thought that this is going to be like a witch hunt by the religious people against these visitors, but surprisingly, it didn't happen. Surprisingly, these religious guys seem to be kind of relatively reasonable, and so especially that one guy, that black guy, who when they showed close-ups of him in the beginning, I kind of suspected the opposite to be the case. When Michael started talking about science, they kind of zoomed on this black guy, and you see kind of suspicion in his eyes, and so I thought, oh, he's going to be the bad guy, he's going to capture them and burn them, and then he did capture them, and then I kind of rolled my eyes and said, oh, here we go, so now they're going to put them on trial as heretics. But then surprisingly the opposite happened, and he seems to be from a secret sect of scientists, so he's actually a good guy. And then the Discovery crew, they're kind of being like the bad guys, lying to his face, trying to convince him that all his scientific theories are wrong. So that's kind of interesting, but also doesn't it make our heroes look bad? Shouldn't Starfleet be all about scientific truth, telling the truth to people? Instead they're lying to his face, saying that he's wrong even though he's correct. And so that kind of annoyed me a little bit, especially since he's human. He's not really from a primitive society. And then they beam up in the church in front of everybody, only convincing them that their religion is true. So they did exactly the opposite of what they should be doing. So that annoyed me a little bit, but at least in the very end they did fix it. Pike came back to that planet, and he told the truth to that guy, and so that ending kind of redeemed what I feared would be kind of stupid. But he only did it in front of that one guy, so that's kind of disappointing, because since they're all humans, then shouldn't they offer to take them back to Earth or something? So it doesn't really make sense. And also, why didn't the black guy ask that they take him with them at least? And so wouldn't he want to leave this place and to go to the stars? He didn't even ask that, and so that was a bit strange as well. They just gave him a battery and he's satisfied with that. So at least in the end they showed kind of the lights turning on the church. So I guess that implies they'll progress scientifically from this point on. I think it would make more sense to actually make contact with them and tell them the truth. There's no real reason not to, just because they developed this separate society, but they're still humans. They still have relatives on Earth, and so it doesn't really make sense. I mean, to abandon them in this way, even though they're your fellow humans, that doesn't seem very logical in my opinion. It's not as if they didn't develop to be able to accept the idea of aliens. Actually, it's not even aliens, that's the idea of space travel. To think they would not be able to accept it, that it will somehow destroy their society. Also, these people came from a time period just before humanity invented the warp technology. And so just because they're a few years too early before that, that makes them somehow so primitive that it would devastate them if you reveal the truth to them. So it didn't make sense. So I still think this is kind of stupid, this whole prime directive applying to humans just because they came from Earth a few years before warp drive was invented. If they were taken to another planet, then they should know about space travel anyway. I guess in this case, because it's a religious society, so you wouldn't, Pike doesn't want to destroy their religion. So maybe that's why also there are hints in this episode of him also being religious himself. So maybe that's why he doesn't want to destroy their religion. He wants them to keep believing, and that's why he doesn't want to reveal the truth. So I think it makes Spike look bad, actually. When Michael says, it's all based on a lie that they believe in the Red Angel, and then Pike says, but can you prove it? Can you prove it? So I was kind of annoyed by Pike in this episode. On the other hand, they do make him to be very charismatic and also very heroic. He's constantly willing to sacrifice himself to save other people, and when some girl accidentally activates a phaser, he suddenly jumps on the phaser to save her, and so this kind of indicates, it foreshadows what his fate will be, because in the original show it was said that he sacrificed himself to save a bunch of kids, and that's why he became deformed and disabled and all of that. Maybe we'll actually see this on the show, it might be interesting, but it's supposed to happen much later, I think. But they're constantly, in every episode, they have to show that Pike is always willing to sacrifice himself to save others. So kind of very heroic, but maybe a little bit over the top and also kind of silly. I mean, wouldn't it be simpler to simply snap that phaser away from that girl? Why the need to jump on the phaser? I mean, did the phaser explode or what? It didn't make sense the way they showed it. That a girl is playing with a phaser, about to shoot, and then he takes the phaser away and jumps on it, and it shoots his stomach. So why not simply aim it somewhere else? Simply slap it away from her hand and aim it at the sky or something. Instead he jumps on the phaser. So it seems as if he's just so eager to die to save someone. Like he's so eager to sacrifice himself like a true Christian or something. So it's a little bit silly and funny and over the top the way he wants to be a hero all the time. But I do like the actor, and he is playing it very charismatically, and it really feels like an old style of a hero on TV, like that perfect kind of hero who is super moral, always willing to do the good thing. He also kind of reminds me of Ed Mercer from the Orville. He's kind of super friendly, very charismatic, very charming, so maybe they're kind of imitating the Orville. And speaking of that, also there was some humor in this episode with Tilly. Like they show her running out of the door and then running onto the other side of the corridors, all kinds of silly moments like that. So the show is trying to be more comedic, which I'm fine with. I do think it improves the show. It's not taking itself so seriously like in season 1, and it also would allow them to do kind of ridiculous stuff without being unintentional funny. Like just accept it as a more comedic show, and then you can do a lot more silly stuff. So I do think it's a good change for the show. Also, Tilly suddenly starts having encounters with some kind of cute officer who is a bit annoying the first time I saw her, but she's kind of cute. She's kind of talking with a strange accent and behaving like childlike, but that was explained later. I'll get to that in a second. And at first I thought they are introducing another character who is also will be kind of silly and comedic and strange. But then in the very end of the episode it turns out it's actually a ghost. It's actually a girl that Tilly knew in her childhood. And maybe this ties with what Stemmen said earlier, that he saw his dead boyfriend in the Spore network, and that he thinks that maybe it's not a delusion, maybe it's actually him in another dimension. So I guess the Spore network is kind of like heaven now, that it contains the souls of people who died. But I love the fact that it's ambiguous, that maybe it's all in his head, maybe he imagined it. And so the same with Tilly, because in the end of the previous season they showed that some strange spore landed on her and went inside her, some kind of green spore from the Spore network, and I was wondering what they'll do with her, because something should happen with that. It wasn't just shown for no reason, so I assumed maybe that explains her personality changing, that she's suddenly even more hyper than she was before, and maybe that explains her strange interactions with that asteroid, because she said previously that the asteroid affects the spores strangely, and if she has some of the spores inside her, maybe that explains that strange accident with her and the asteroid, and now she's seeing a spirit of someone she knew as a kid. And so I hope they will leave it ambiguous. Just don't answer the question, is that really the soul of that childhood friend, or is it all in Tilly's head? I hope they kind of leave it ambiguous, and that way we can think whatever we want about it. So leave something to the imagination. You can imply that maybe it's something real, or you can imply it's all in her head and it's like an imaginary friend. So I did kind of like this whole part of Tilly meeting this ghost from her past. It was kind of interesting. Also, I do like the science fiction mystery elements of this new season. I do like the fact that there's a science fiction slash fantasy kind of plot that they're investigating in the kind of mystery, and also these little mysteries on the ship. And I do think it has the potential to be an interesting story later, and so I hope they will develop it properly, and the whole thing with the Red Angel. My only fear is that, first of all, that they might drag this out too long. Maybe it will be the whole season, so that would be kind of boring if they drag it out too long. And also I fear they will provide a very stupid explanation in the end, and I hope they won't. I hope it will be something interesting and unexpected and complex and not something stupid. So that's my biggest fear. What else did I like in this episode? I like the whole thing with the asteroid, the fact that they used it to save the planet, even though the way they did it was kind of strange. I mean, if it's so massive, so gravitationally strong, then how is their ship not being pulled to it? I guess they're using that anti-gravity thing, but if they're able to hold that supermassive asteroid inside their ship using artificial gravity, then shouldn't they be able to tractor beam those rocks away by themselves? Why do they need to use that asteroid to do that? So it didn't really make sense. I guess it's because of the radiation. I guess they just couldn't stay close enough to those rocks with their own ship, and so that's why they had to use this asteroid to do it. I guess I can make up excuses for that. It seemed a little bit fishy, but I did like the overall idea. I did like the idea itself because it feels like Star Trek, you know, saving other planets from extinction, all that kind of stuff. And also they gave hope to those people in the end. They gave them electricity, basically, even though it shouldn't be that hard to invent electricity from people from the 2050s. And they seem to have all the equipment, so all they needed to do was to rotate a turbine to create electricity. It shouldn't be that hard, and yet they couldn't do it for 200 years until they get this battery from Discovery, so that's a little bit stupid, I think. Unless they had that evil theocracy thing, which I expected they would have, but they didn't. They didn't seem evil at all, and so if they're allowing these scientists to try to fix up electricity, then what's the excuse for the scientists for not being able to do that for 200 years? How hard is it to invent electricity? It's not that hard, and so that was a bit ridiculous, but I did like the overall idea that, okay, they gave them a piece of technology and now they have electricity, and they light it inside the church, and so the church will kind of become a church of science, I guess, and it will put them on the right path, and they did it in a way that doesn't directly violate the Prime Directive, even though it didn't make sense because they're humans from Earth. But I do like that idea. It had that spirit of Star Trek. It did feel like a Star Trek episode, finally. It finally feels like a Star Trek show about exploring science fiction ideas, meeting other cultures, and all those kinds of ideas. So overall, I do think this is a big improvement. Also visually, the show seems to be improving. They kind of changed the style. They turned on the lights. It's not as dark as before. It's not all blue all the time. There are less lens flares, less shaky cam. It's all much more clear looking, so that's a good thing. And so that's my opinion on Star Trek Discovery. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and we can discuss it. If you enjoy my videos, please like them, please subscribe, click the notification bell to see updates of new videos, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye bye.